All right, this is the Think Small from our Think Big, Think Small series for verified testing. Last week, we talked about code coverage reports. So I'm just going to give a quick recap and we'll link to the Think Big discussion in the comments of this video. The ideal outcome, or my takeaway anyway, was that a developer or team lead could use some sort of view of a coverage report in GitLab to show areas of missing tests. User could then create an issue to resolve that uncovered test, or uncovered code, sorry, with a test, which in turn could auto-generate an MR with a template for a test. So that would allow a user to, just within GitLab, apply a test, add more code coverage, never need to open their IDE, all pretty quickly with an issue and an MR, all within the tool. Drew, Ricky, did I miss anything there from our recap, or as a recap from last week?
No, I think we did focus a lot on kind of exposing that page view, like to have coverage as its own top level entity in GitLab. So you could go and view the coverage report in GitLab for your project, as opposed to, I think now a lot of that's handled by CI artifacts that get uploaded, and then people can expose them with the expose as keyword. And so those are completely, essentially external to GitLab.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Cool. All right, well, it looks like, Ricky, you already started on the first question. What's the hardest part of this problem to solve? Giving someone an easy way to add test coverage when we know that there is a gap.
Yeah, I think that along with a lot of our features, the difficult thing is just storing the data that we need in order to make these reports happen. Projects can have hundreds of thousands of tests and hundreds of thousands of files, and those files each can have millions of lines. And so how are we going to be able to represent this in a scalable way that we can build into the application? Even just loading, for example, the HTML reports that get generated for the main GitLab project, if you click on that to open it in a tab, you should probably just go get a coffee, because it's gonna take a bit for those HTML files to load up into your browser.
I think it would be helpful to decide in advance exactly what use cases we want to show the data in, because I think that's I think a more practical way to get to how should we store it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that we'll arrive at one like grand storage model that will be easy to query for every workflow. And so if we know that we want to look at coverage one file at a time because we want to implement it for the file browser, that should be a really helpful sort of starting direction to say, we can, we know we have this scope we can use. I don't think line by line coverage data for a whole project is ever going to be like a big, crazy graphic anywhere. So starting with a specific scope like that, I think would give us good direction on the storage.
Just dig into that a little bit more. If we were solving this for ourselves, what would be that use case? Say, Drew, you added code and you realize it wasn't covered, or you opened a project that you're working on and you realize there's code in the file you've opened that isn't covered. Is there a use case there?
So that would be by file, which that's like that. I went with by file because I think it was the first thing that popped into my head. Like when you're browsing code in GitLab, you're usually looking at one file, or a merge request, which is going to be a set of 30 files. But that's a very common unit of like code to browse.
Mm-hmm. Can we provide that with that test coverage visualization that we have, extending it beyond just the MR diff and into just the raw file view or the web IDE view?
I think we can. It's right now, I think, and Ricky, please correct me if I've missed something recently. I think all the coverage data comes from artifacts, maybe pipeline artifacts, but still like an external file stored somewhere else with all the coverage in it. And so that, and we fetch it, 4 files in a merge request. So that the mechanics are there, but I don't think in a way that it makes sense to scale up to like repository browsing.
Yeah, I think there'd still be a little bit of effort because the way it works right now is sorry, my cat's being ridiculous. The pipeline artifact entity was created in order to solve this problem. So basically after the pipeline is done running for a merge request, we'll parse that Cobertura report and kind of pick out the pieces that are relevant to the merge request. And then that's how we can load the inline coverage information in a performant way, because we're not parsing the entire file for every single possible piece of code coverage information. We're really only looking at what is going to be displayed in the MR-diff view. And that makes it challenging to say that we can easily just go and do it on a file by file level, because then we will be parsing the entire Cobertura report every time we load a new file in the file browser, and that won't be as performant as this, where we can basically come up with a subset in a background job and then push that file somewhere and have easy access to it, which allows that to be performant.
Sorry, I just want to confirm the pipeline artifacts that we use for the merge request diff view now, the artifact is not a full coverage report. It's a diff of 2 larger coverage reports. We persist diffs.
Is it a diff or is it a parsed, shrunken report of the current state?
Okay, right. So it's cut down to the files involved in the merge request?
That's my understanding, yeah.
Okay.
Max was here.
Yeah. Okay, but it's definitely not the full report, because so we're doing like some of that scoping already, where you said, we know it's only these files, so throw away everything else. But
yeah,
we have to do that without being able to throw away everything else.
I think that the hard part is really coming up with that the first class view for the coverage report. Like we would need to make like a new page that's like, okay, here's code coverage for your project, like project level code coverage. I think that's the real kind of can of spaghetti. And we can do lots of little things that kind of maybe will add value to the way that people interact with that report. But opening up that big can of spaghetti is going to be a process no matter what. I think that an example of something that would be small that we could add value with would be to like reverse TFF lookup when there's missing tests and say, hey, you should write a test in this file for this uncovered line in your merge.
If we slimmed that down even more and just said, here is the file that you should add a test to, or the file with not lowest coverage. I don't know what the right one thing is, but just say, here is the file that you can open up today, have some impact, and then tomorrow this report might look different. That seems like a minimum change, where when the pipeline report runs and gets that diff, we would also be able to grab, like, here's the file that we need to go look at and care about and store it for the project. Is that reasonable? I guess that leads into, is that risky? Being that opinionated?
Well, so what we're really talking about is just flagging an individual file and saying this file has a problem.
Yeah, so pulling up even from like the day-to-day workflow of I'm going in and I'm writing code because I have an issue. More of a, I'm looking at a project because the project has low code coverage. Where can we have impact to move this up and to the right, or test coverage, not code coverage?
Right.
So I guess that depends on whether we're targeting merge requests or if we're targeting like the project view still, right? So if we're targeting merge requests, prompting people in the merge request about the code coverage of the files that they're working on would be important. But if we're talking about that view for that team lead or director persona, then I think that's something else to talk about.
What I learned from the conversations that we've had already is that the team lead, director, whatever that persona is, cares about that top-down project view. They want to see, hey, we have a group goal. Where can we impact that group goal? Developers in their day-to-day want the visualization we've already provided. I'm doing a code review. I want to see if this code also now has test coverage, the code that was changed or the code that was added. And so we've already met their primary need based on at least my understanding of those conversations. So the persona would be that team lead.
So it sounds like there's a similar mechanism for both of those views, where on we ignore the line by line. We don't persist anything line by line. The most granular unit that we're talking about is a file, and we're saying, hey, this file's no good, or this file's good and this other file isn't good. You know, here's a ranked list by like thumb emojis of like, here's your worst files and your best files. That would, I think, lend itself to a merge request pretty easily, because it's just, if somebody touches a file and we see that that file is bad, we can, you know, surface something in the merge request that's like, coverage is here. We noticed this file is bad. Go try and make it good, right? Like a very basic, simplistic sort of flagging system to say like, this, you know, caution on this file.
I think that
how could we get the first bite out of the top-down view? Like, what's the least riskiest, smallest step we could possibly take toward getting a project level code coverage?
Can we easily get to a thumbs up, thumbs down out of the existing coverage report, like a full coverage report? I haven't looked at like a big Coverterra report in ages, and so I'm like, I don't know.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you would derive thumbs up, thumbs down from coverage percentages or lines covered?
90% of lines covered is thumbs up.
Okay.
100% of lines covered is the, you know, ta-da thing. Yeah.
Ta-da.
The way I look at it is like, look at the overall project average for coverage and then see if it's on what side of that average.
That would be a good one. If we get to thresholds too, you could start to drive it with that and say this is below your threshold. But I like that idea of this file is below the average coverage for the project. So it's driving down your coverage, at least as a starting point.
Right. It's a nice like automatic moving threshold where it's like, just always work on the worst thing. And when the worst thing is better, something else will be the worst thing now. And you know.
Yeah. Yep. I wonder about having, if we're only storing a limited subset of the mapping between files and their coverage, and we're literally just talking this file and then this number is a percentage, and we put that in the database, I wonder how expensive that would be. I know there are some concerns around doing stuff like that with the database, but it might be less bad and more performant to tie it to a file really simplistically like that. And then if our first go at the page was, here's the lowest covered files, the 10 lowest covered files even, like we're not going to show you the whole thing. We're not going to let you filter or search or do anything. Here's the 10 lowest, and that's the first swap. First.
I think that like not static, but very prescriptive view would be a great MVC of just, you have test coverage in this file. Here are the files that are the lowest below the average coverage in the project.
You're talking about like one row per file in the database?
But I would do it, but just for 10 files.
Yeah, you could have a background job that parsed the coverture report and found the 10 lowest covered files, and then just stored those 10 in the database. Then you wouldn't come into any performance requirements besides parsing the coverture report, which were already.
Yeah, even if
right.
you.
Which is that's not a timely operation. We can do that in the background whenever.
Yeah.
Sorry, James, you were saying.
Well, I was just thinking, like, if you're generating coverture reports when you're building your default branch, then we can just get it then. But I don't know if that's always going to be the case for somebody's pipeline. So yeah, we could, if you're uploading them as part of something else, then just do it as a background job. I think worst 10 is totally reasonable. I think this would also likely be an up tier feature because it is targeted not at the developer persona, but at the team leader director persona. So it would be, we would also potentially naturally restrict how many database rows we have that way. I think though that bit, the storage, on our side is the riskiest. And as far as adoption of the feature, performance would be the riskiest bit. Am I missing risk in this feature or the outcome that we're trying to get at here?
The one thing that always bothers me when I was using code coverage tools is when the application wasn't keeping up with the changes I was making to the configs. So if I ran a thing and then I saw the visualization for the coverage job that I ran, and it had like a bunch of config files as like the top worst files, and then I was like, oh, okay, then I have to go back and like take the config files out of my, ignore them when I'm going to parse them, and then I'd run it again, and then I'd have to wait for the thing to refresh and process the results and then reload the top 10 worst files. And I'd be like, okay, I don't care about any of these files. I'm going to remove all those ones from the thing. And it was like this very lengthy process in actually getting a view that I care about in the app. And then if it's not in front of people's eyes all the time, when if you're using a third-party external service, if people aren't looking at that a lot, then it gets stale right away. So if it's something that I look at every 2 weeks, I'm basically going back in there and altering it to ignore files that I don't matter because they're config or they're third-party or it's something that just doesn't need coverage. And so I think that problem is pretty much solved by bringing it into GitLab because it's putting it in front of people's faces.
We could also maybe have a simpler exclusion mechanism that sort of like, add this to your ignores file and commit and push and run a new pipeline and wait for the new report to upload. Like, I don't think if we're working with regular rows in the database, if we have an active record model that handles this stuff, I feel like there should be a more UI based way to just quickly say like, click no, not that one.
Yeah, and I did see that with the software I was using, but with the version of the software that I was using, I think I was using the free tier or something, and it would ignore it, but it wouldn't be consistent, I guess, is the best way to put it.
Can we do something simple like if we were applying this to the GitLab project, the highest percentage of files I'm guessing are Ruby files, and a file has to be, actually, does that work on lines of code or on files? Anyway, that's rhetorical. Could we use that identification and say that it's of your top language identified? Those are the only files that we care about. At least for an MVC type of approach, to see if there's value here. And if there is, naturally there's going to be extension of like, oh, well, I want to specify which kind of file extensions I care about, or which files exactly I care about, which files to ignore, do some things that way.
I don't know that extensions is going to be, it's even in the Rails app, there's a decent number of Ruby files that are like migrations, right? There's 600 million migrations in DB migrate, and none of them have like test coverage.
They do their coverage.
That way.
They do have test coverage.
Really? Oh, great. I forgot about that. But you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of ancillary Ruby files.
Yeah, just like configs and
initializers. Yeah. Which those, yeah, initializers probably do. So file extension might not get us all the way. It might not allow us to not have a solution beyond that. It might get us halfway there.
The way I was kind of thinking of it would be that we would pay attention only to the files that are in the report. So when you generate a coverture report, you set up all your ignores in the config for the tool that you're using to generate the report. And then of the files that are included in your report, these are the bad ones. And that's how we would persist that data. We wouldn't go looking for more files. We would be like, okay, from what you've shared with us, this is the problem.
Is this opting in all your files to coverage reporting?
I think you'd only be opting in the files that you've opted in with the tool. So like with RSpec,
right.
These are the ones that aren't. The problem though is going to be like, how do you, if you want to make an exception, how do you synchronize that back to your project if you make an exception in the UI? So if it's like, oh yeah, these are the 10 worst, but I don't really care about these 5. Like, how do you pull that back in easily? Like a first iteration would be like, okay, great, now go change your config for RSpec so you're not including these 5. But like, is there a way that we can make?
I was thinking about keeping exclusions in, and this, you know, expands the size of the table, but in the database table as like a different, essentially, you know, we're talking about 1 row per file. So every row has a path, but then you could have a row in there as a top 10 bad file or as an exclusion. And so no matter what's running under the hood, when we're persisting something in like essentially our presentation layer service model, whatever this is, the idea that something is excluded from presentation in GitLab, not fully excluded from like your actual coverage tool.
Yeah, that's how SonarQube works as well. There's multiple layers of possible places where you could go and exclude a file or a line from being reported on. And you can do it in the config, you can do it in the SonarQube UI. I think you can even do it in like before it gets to the config as well. And that makes it a little bit difficult to figure out when you're looking at your configuration holistically. It's like, where is this ignored? And like, what if you care about it again? How can I go about getting that back? So
right.
I'm not sure that's a problem that we can solve easily. I think the easy first step would be to do, as you said, and just keep track of those exclusions as something separate and find a way to
I have a question.
So we only have a couple of minutes left. What could we do in that next milestone to try to test this idea? Is there even a non-UI version of this that we could build on the Covertura report that's uploaded?
Eric, what was your question?
Sorry, I was going to ask, because we were talking about persisting information into the database. Is this for the project-wide coverage view when you go into a project page and just only view a specific project's data? Or do we need to store in the database because we want to query from the groups level? Because I'm thinking, if it's just like, if I'm the project owner, or like if I look at just one project page and I want to see the coverage, I guess, report for that project, then maybe we could just rely on the latest pipeline artifact of the master branch or whatever its default branch is. Because right now we store, let's say, master branch has its own Covertura artifact. So that Covertura artifact will have all the coverage information of all the files that were run or like covered in the RSpec suite for that. So we could actually just show the information, and even maybe I just want to share my screen fast. Maybe it's easier to explain. So I'm looking at the RSpec. These are RSpec report. So maybe just like what Drew was suggesting earlier, I think just prioritize the files that has like lower. Maybe you could just rely on the line rate of this. It's like the whole projects or like the whole suite's line rate, and then maybe if a certain class has a lower line rate than the main one, then maybe show it as like a priority, like, so because this is like the moving threshold that we were trying to, like, if I understand it right, we were talking about earlier. So yeah, and I think we have to show it per build, or else we will end up like averaging per builds coverage again. So maybe as like a small step, we could just like show this is the latest coverage information from your default branch per build, like for RSpec, for Karma, Jest, whatever. If they end up splitting their Covertura reports into separate RSpec jobs, then the MVC would show separate coverage information per RSpec job.
Yeah, I think the reason why we would want to look into the database is because if we were wanting to make that analysis from the default branches artifact for every time somebody looked at that page, it would get a little squirrely. We could probably use cache instead and kind of parse it once in the background and push it into cache, or we could push it into the database instead of cache. But I think we'd probably want to avoid on-the-fly parsing of a Covertura report when the page is.
Yeah, just to be clear, I'm not because we parse the XML on a background job once the pipeline finishes. So and then we store the JSON data to the pipeline artifact table. So we'll just basically display the JSON information, and then I guess depending on the analysis we need to do, then maybe we could cache them into their own JSON column or data, maybe. Depends.
Yeah,
but I think when
you're saying just pull it out.
Yeah, because every file information will be in that JSON object. So it's not the XML anymore.
Right. So we still have one row per file in a new table, but then one of the columns in that table is all your detailed coverage, like whatever. Is that the granularity you're talking about, Eric?
The current setup, or
no? What you're saying now, if we had.
Because I was thinking if.
Go ahead.
Yeah, because I was trying to understand why we need to persist data in the database now. Because I was thinking initially we could just rely on the JSON information in our current pipeline artifact, because that stores JSON, not XML anymore. The one because once the pipeline finishes, we parse the XML and store it into like a JSON artifact where it has the coverage data per file found from the artifact. So depending on how we want to analyze in the first iteration, maybe we don't need to purchase data in the database yet. If it's not that heavy, if it's like based on the configuration, don't show this file. If that's it, then I don't think we need to purchase anything in the database. But if it gets complex, then maybe we will need to figure out where to put that complex analysis result in like a database or like reactive cache or whatever.
So if I understand you correctly, your pitch for like the first step we could take to do this would be to basically where we are right now, currently parsing the Cobertura pipeline artifact, we would add a little bit more information into that pipeline artifact. We could do like the top 10 worst files in JSON file and then coverage percentage in a JSON blob, and then persist that into the existing pipeline artifact. And then when we want to make this page, we would just go and load that pipeline artifact for the page, and then we would make a table that just had the top 10 worst files. Like that would be the steps.
Well, the first smallest step I would suggest is not store like the top 10 or top whatever. I was
Just
thinking it might be
the JSON artifact totally on the fly.
Yes, it's like we would probably add a more generic information like the total average or like the topmost coverage line rate, for example, and then the line rate per file, and that's it. And then maybe on the UI, maybe JavaScript or Rails view, we would just iterate through the JSON object and show these are the files that has lower line rate than the topmost, like the root line rate, and that's like the first release.
Do you think storing all the files in in objects like that would be too much? Like that's what I'm concerned about here. Is if and by storing I mean writing to the pipeline artifact file. Do you think that having every single file in coverage is too expensive? That's what I was concerned about, and that's why I suggested just having like the 10 worst ones in that are actually getting written to.
Yeah, we could. Because I was just thinking this because we're doing right now.
We're thinking
just like trying
really small.
Yeah, I mean, because that's how the implementation works now. We don't limit what we store in the artifact anyway. So if a certain pipeline runs the whole RSpec suite of GitLab, that's basically I think what our Cobertura report has. Then we store whole JSON object thing for few files for change in that MR. I think because I'm looking at this and I see like 8,000 classes already in this XML file. But yeah, it may be a performance issue. We need to like.
I think if it's something that's fairly easy to build and it's on a page by itself, we would get feedback from users that I want to access this page, but the performance is just really slow without impacting anything else in the app. And that would give us the feedback that they want value out of this, they get value out of this, or they see value out of this data. Now we can iterate on a more performance solution. So that might be a great MVC of build it on the fly. Have a page that lives off of the project level code coverage for bad files and go from there. Cool. We are way over on time. Sorry about that, folks. I think we got to a really good spot, though. It sounds like y'all hashed out a lot of how this would get implemented and found a pretty MVC approach to it, as well as even some iterations, I think, within there. And yeah, so I think this is awesome. Anything else before we adjourn?
No, sorry for sidetracking.
Train of thought too much. I'm sorry, what was that, Ricky?
I said sorry for sidetracking.
I fully expected it to happen with this crowd. I think this was a really good discussion.
All right, well, thank you.
Y'all. Thanks. All right, thanks, folks.
Take care.
Cheers.